Hello class, welcome back. This is the third video for Chapter 1, Sociological Perspectives, Theory, and Methods. So we talked about what is sociology and sociological imagination. We went through the first couple theorists, and we're going to move on to the next section of theorists, starting with W.E.B. Du Bois. He is the most notable and well-known of our Black sociologists. Du Bois relentlessly researched on social issues of race, and he wrote probably the most comprehensive study on the history of the slave trade. He was the first African American to earn his PhD from Harvard, all of which are accomplishments that are amazing. Even today, to complete a PhD from Harvard is amazing, but to have done it when he did it is just profound. He really was a proponent of the type of research that was aimed at moving us towards change for the positive. So he was what we call an applied sociologist. He wrote The Souls of Black Folk. That's probably what he's the most well known for, and he wrote it, with this perspective of kind of a down-to-earth approach to sociology. So looking at things very pragmatically and moving towards promoting equality within society. Now, for the first half of 20th century, he continued to work as an author, a lecturer, and an educator, but his teachings really were just immensely important to the civil rights of the 50s and 60s. And he's actually one of the founders of the NAACP, along with our next sociologist, who is Jane Addams. She was also probably one of the most highly successful sociologists and social reformer of her time. She did come from a background of wealth and prestige, but she was the co-founder to the NAACP. If you don't know what the NAACP is, I think we mentioned it before, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But she worked for the advancement not only for blacks, but for all workers and anybody who was exploited. She's the reason why we have the 8-hour workday, why we have anti-child labor laws. What you guys might not know is that unions are extremely connected, and the beginning of unions and labor laws are very connected to anti-child abuse laws and anti-child labor laws. So things like the 5-day work week and the 8-hour workday were very big monumental movements movements forward for the working class, and she really had a big part to play in that. Another female that had a big part to play in our history of sociology is Harriet Martineau. She was also a social reformist. She could probably be considered the first woman sociologist. She wrote the first systematic methodological treatise in sociology. She conducted extended international comparative studies on social institutions. She translated Auguste Comte's work into English, and she actually facilitated the introduction of sociology and positivism into the United States. So her stuff is, again, monumental and a huge force in our history, especially connected to sociology. What makes her really kind of unique and interesting is that she was actually able to make sociology fairly popular in her time, because she took the type of positivistic method, scientific method that we use in sociology, and combine that with popular literature type of novels. So it made it accessible for people to want to read on an everyday basis. And that's one of the things that sometimes as scientists we forget. It's hard to, negotiate that very strict adherence to scientific method and writing in such a way that makes it popular and interesting for other people to do or to read. The next person up that we're going to talk about is C. Wright Mills. Now, C. Wright Mills is most well known for his analysis on the power elite, and he was known as a reform sociologist who tried to push sociologists in that direction. So he wanted people to do applied sociology. He wanted other sociologists to do applied sociology. And he really pushed in that direction to get his colleagues to do the same. He's most well known for his work on the power elite, but during his time, this was actually very controversial. However, his work today, the evidence that supports it, and the theories that he promoted are pretty well accepted as a standard for how our society is divided and how our global corporation and global world works today. Essentially, the power elite, according to Mills, the elite occupy a level of power that they've been able to maintain over a long period of time. Think of like a quasi-caste system. You have to be born into the elite to be an elite. Your children, if you are elite, your children are elite. If your children are elite, your children's children are elite. It's pretty rare for somebody to break into that elite status. And he asserted essentially that democracy is a fiction, and that basically in modern America that we're controlled by just a few top executives from the most powerful companies, the executive branch of the government, and top military officers. And if you think about what that means, a lot of people consider this to be sort of a quasi conspiracy theory. But the evidence really does support the argument that he's making. If you want to look at just top executives from the most powerful companies, think about Monsanto and the food company, or the food industry, that they dominate. I believe over 90% of the food industry is dominated by Monsanto alone. Or if you think about oil companies like I can't remember it off the top of my head. You would know it if you heard the name, but we basically have one oil company that does all of the refining for the entire world, and approximately 95% of all the oil goes through that one company. I lost my train of thought. So Mills basically asserts that the elite don't even need to know that they are, or be aware that they occupy the position and the power that they do, that they're not doing it necessarily with the intentions, but that it is part of their status and their culture to maintain and to assert that control over the masses in our society. And then that brings us to our last theorist. Now, this is George Herbert Mead, who I share my namesake with. Almost my entire. I'm also G Mead like him. So Mead's probably most well known for his work on the mind, self, and society. Now, he wrote extensively and did publish numerous articles, but he never published any books. It was actually his students who edited and published books after his death. They compiled his works from his lectures and other things that he had written, because even though he wrote extensively, he didn't publish. He takes more of an interactionist approach to his understanding on human perspectives. And it kind of deals with the stages of development. So think about his theories as an interaction between individuals and society. His analysis basically represents an outline of how our society becomes possible. So let me kind of explain this to you. If you think about a very young child, they're really only able to see things from their own perspective. If, a baby is going to really only respond to their own stimuli, if they're hurt, if they're hungry, if they're cold, that kind of thing. As we get older, we're able to see things from maybe our brothers or sisters' perspective, our parents' perspective, people close to us. And then as we get even older, we're able to see things from a more generalized other perspective. That's why when you see very little kids doing something like playing soccer, they look like a hive of bees just following the ball around, because they really don't understand how to interact in that type of game. They can only see from really their perspective or one or two other people. They don't really understand that group dynamic perspective. So it makes it very challenging for them to try to play a specific role in kind of a team game like that. So he really Mead had 4 stages. So when we're talking about the mind and mind, self, and society, it starts with this impulse, a reaction, like I mentioned earlier, to stimuli. So when a baby is hungry, a baby cries. That's a simple reaction to stimuli. As you develop into a perception. So you can perceive the difference between things. That's why little toddlers are very interested in identifying what they see in the world around them. They'll tell their dad, is that a dog? Is that a cat? Is that whatever type of animal? Is that a horse? So they know, and you see them oftentimes point, horsey, doggy, kitty, right? And what they're doing is they're developing in terms of being able to differentiate between those different things. As we get a little bit older, we're able to understand more of a manipulation. So once we identify the difference, you're trying to see what's appropriate action. So now I see a doggy. Is it appropriate for me to pet the doggy? So you might hear a little girl say to her daddy, "Dad, can I pet that doggy?" And wait for a response, because she's still learning what is the appropriate action. If I'm hungry, can I eat that hamburger? Can I eat that French fries? Can I eat that apple? Can I eat those pieces of banana? You're still learning what is the appropriate action and reaction to things. In addition to that, something that Mead says is very unique to human beings, although we're not sure that this is necessarily completely true anymore. There's some evidence that some other animals have fairly well developed identities as well. That's besides the point. I don't want to confuse you. But human beings have the ability to understand symbols. So symbols, this is a term that's used for a wide variety of different things. Now, symbols, when you think of a police officer's badge, that's a symbol. And that's a pretty obvious symbol. Or when you think of somebody wearing short hair or long hair, that's a symbol of their gender, but it's not necessarily always an accurate symbol of their gender. In addition to that, even our language. So if you think about some of the hand gestures that we use, the way that we speak, and the words we use, those are all symbols, and it helps us develop our identity. And in this process is very necessary for the development of ourself in terms of society. So communication becomes an essential to the development of the self, according to Mead. Basically, he says that if you do not have any communication with anyone outside of yourself ever, you cannot develop a sense of self. And when we talk about culture, we'll talk about children who were considered to be feral children, or completely neglected children who have no interaction with other human beings. And you see the difference between their verbal ability and their identity of self, how they've developed it, is just drastically affected. So since communication is so essential, you have to be a member of a society to be a self. You need to be able to, at another stage of development, understand what we call the generalized other. The generalized other is an idea of what everybody else thinks of you. So think about it in terms of a teenager's preoccupation with what other people think. Because teenagers are still developing their sense of self, they're at the stage where what others think of them becomes a preoccupation for them, because it's very vital or important to their own perception of their own identity and who they become and who they are. And as you get older, the perspective of others on yourself is then kind of crystallized into more or less a coherent, stable conception of yourself. This actually means that society really does exert some measure of control over us as individuals. Even when we don't realize it, it actually is exerting quite a bit of control. What we think to be internal control, I don't feel comfortable breaking in a line, or I don't feel comfortable screaming in when I'm in a library or a quiet room. This is actually societal control or social control, as opposed to some type of internal control. It's simply that we have actually internalized that social control, and that's why it feels like it's coming from the inside. Lastly, I just want to talk about the difference between the I and the me in terms of Mead's theories. And essentially, the me is the self as an object. It's the organized set of attitudes that others have of you that are assumed. And the I is more of your understanding of how others perceive you and their attitudes of you. So where the me becomes fixed, I understand others perceive me as this. I am still developing the I. I like to think about this in terms of what we perceive to be race. We know others may perceive us to be Hispanic or white or black or Asian, but we know that we may or may not fit into that category. You may be perceived as Asian and yet you're Hispanic, or you might be perceived as Hispanic but yet you're Hawaiian. You might be perceived as white but you consider yourself black. And that's kind of one way to think about it. It's understanding the definition of the me from the external perspective and your own influence of the I and who I am. So that's it for our theorists, and our next video is going to be on theoretical perspectives, paradigms, and research methods.